Hello, and welcome to another MarketMuse Content Strategy webinar. I'm your host and co-founder and chief product officer for MarketMuse, Jeff Coyle. And today's discussion is going to be about some really important concepts for content teams, about optimization, time, and efficiency. And it's titled Customizing Your Content Workflow for Maximum Efficiency. Before I get into who our special guest is today, a few housekeeping notes. If you haven't been to a MarketMuse Content Strategy webinar before, ask us questions on GoToWebinar. It's on the right side of your screen for most screens. Whether they're relevant, if they're relevant to the conversation, we'll try to answer them in line, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. But we'll also have a Q&A at the end for anything that doesn't fit with the discussion. And again, ask us anything from strategic, workflows, search engine optimization, content strategy, anything up and down the line. The recording and notes will be sent to you via email afterwards as well. So keep that in mind and look for that email. And also, we have a significant pool of existing webinars from high growth startup founders like Brennan White from Cortex, sales visionaries like Bob Apollo, Andy Crestodina, Stefan Spencer, SEO folks, and just all around brilliant people like Kevin Indig who at G2 have done webinars with us over the course of the last 12 months. Look for those. If you download multiple webinars this week, shoot me a note, tell me about it, tell me what you thought. I'll personally set up a content strategy session with our content advisory team leads, and we can have that conversation. But now I'll intro today's special guest. He's the head of content at Gather Content, where he's built kind of one of the best teams of writers on the planet, focused on strategy, quality, and scalability. He leads all their community work. And I would recommend consuming as much of their webinar, books, guides, and masterclass content as you can. Also, when I walked into our Boston headquarters today, I noticed we had one of his books sitting on our front desk, a content delivery. So they're making physical books as well as online materials. Really just an awesome company, and I'm so glad that we've gotten connected over the course of the last few months. And so welcome, Robert Mills.
Thank you, Jeff. Hello, everyone. It's nice to be on video to see who I'm talking to, which is lovely. Thank you for that really kind introduction as well. I really appreciate that. Thank you, Jeff.
For sure. And so before we jump into our discussion today, tell the audience a little bit more about Gather Content and your background in everything from audience research, journalism, to now managing, a really amazing content team.
Yeah, I'll start with a bit about Gather Content. So Gather Content is a content operations platform, and it's really a tool to replace the chaos of content production, which typically for many organizations involves email, Google Docs, information locked in people's heads, which can be the worst place for information to be often, presentations, and all those kind of things. So it's a central hub to bring all of your content, all of your people, all of your processes into one place. One of the big features is workflow, which obviously we're going to talk quite a lot about today. But it's just bringing it into one place with a bespoke workflow, structured content. You can embed your content style guide. So it's just bringing some order and structure to the big challenge of content creation and production. And then on a personal level, you've mentioned a couple of things there from my background. So I'm a journalism graduate, so writing's always been a strand in my various jobs. When I graduated, content strategy didn't have that label, so I never knew I was going to be a content strategist. But here I am. I think lots of people segue in from journalism. Worked in the BBC in audience research for just for a year, so that was a really valuable experience for the sort of role I'm in now. Joined Gather Content in 2015 as a content strategist and moved into head of content February this year, working in the product on UX copy and that kind of stuff, but also doing the things that Jeff mentioned around the educational resources, our community strategy, and just trying to facilitate opportunity and content for people to level up and learn around content strategy and content operations, really.
Awesome. Well, yeah, I think that's really covers comprehensively, kind of everything I know about Gather Content, and he really gives an idea of some of the background and how, day to day you're working inside, ideally optimizing workflows. And it really segues well into our discussion today. And so from your standpoint, what's the important characteristics of a content workflow? And from my take on it is, how do we ensure that all the team members, or if I'm in an agency client situation, clients understand the whole workflow? And how important is that to success for teams working with gather content or your team?
Very important. I mean, the first thing is have a workflow, or actually have a deliberate workflow, because if you're publishing content, then there's a process. It may not be a process that you've sat down and thought about. It may just be it's the way we've always done it. So it always goes through these stages and these people, and then we always face these same bottlenecks and challenges and delays. But often people just accept the status quo as well. It's the way we do it, without thinking how can we improve this, or they don't have the luxury of time to be able to think about making improvements. So I think have a deliberate workflow, which I think is probably something that we'll talk more about as the conversation goes. But really thinking about what stages do we need, what people at each stage. In terms of getting everybody involved to understand the workflow, I think that's very important. So obviously the most important thing for them to know is what am I doing and when. But I always say that give them visibility of the entire workflow so they understand where the content's come from and where it's going to next. Because I just think it's just a sensible approach to kind of aligning people around the entire workflow. It's whenever there's people involved, there are challenges and resistance and conflicting priorities and agendas, especially if people have got busy jobs and content's perhaps not the main focus of that job. So it's already slipping down the agenda and the to-do list. So a workflow should be there to make their lives easier, to empower them, to give them what they need to do their job more easily. It's not meant to be like another tool, another process, another way. It's meant to be there to make their lives easier as individuals, and then collectively as your content team or as your project team, to ensure that they're able to deliver content on time and in budget, which therefore has positive implications for the business or the organization.
Yeah, I think you nailed it, that everybody's got a lot of things on their plate, regardless of whether they're have one title or they're actually wearing 5 hats, and it's very easy to say, oh well, the guide launched, that's all I had to do, the other stuff is now nice to have. And when editorial leadership may feel differently, a lot of when the process isn't supported with that shared source of truth, things like updating, regular optimization, building some support content when maybe things didn't go well when you published, all kind of become optional. And I find that, like you said, the workflow makes sure that everybody's on the same page. And, on that note, with a shared workflow, what do you see the most, where do you see the most pitfalls when you don't have this in place?
Yeah, you've got a few on screen, which I completely agree with, bottlenecks. So I guess if we just talk a little bit more on those 4, and then I'll add some other maybe thoughts there. But bottlenecks, yeah. So why isn't your content progressing? We've already touched on this a little bit. Perhaps somebody's got too much to do. It's not that they don't want to do the content or they don't understand the value of that and the importance of it, but they might just have too much to manage. If you don't have a workflow, you know who's involved and who should be doing what when, it can be very difficult to identify those bottlenecks and try and put things in place like a workflow or extra staffing or whatever it might be to avoid those bottlenecks. And I used to work at an agency, working with lots of clients on mainly website projects where content could delay or derail them. And often we weren't aware of the bottlenecks until it was arguably too late, because there was no accountability. So nobody was able to flag, right, actually, why isn't the content progressing? It's like, oh, I didn't know it was my job, or I didn't know it was my responsibility. I didn't know that was my task. And we got roles and responsibilities later on that slide there. So I think bottlenecks is definitely a big risk. And then going back to the roles and responsibilities, you need to have you don't have people for the sake of it. Often people don't want to get involved in content, and that's the challenge. How do we get people on board, and how do we align people, and how do we get people to understand? But the opposite is that perhaps sometimes people are too keen, or they want to be involved in everything. Instead of too many cooks, too many stakeholders can be a common issue. And so you really need to focus on what roles and responsibilities do we need, and only have those defined within your workflow that are necessary, so that we aren't creating more, I guess, challenges for ourselves by having more people involved than we need. The process issues, I think, it's more perhaps a lack of process, and also it's, there's no, with anything around content strategy and content operations, there's no one size fits all. So even within one, I've done a lot of research and work with higher education institutions where, they're decentralized, lots of silos, lots of subject matter experts. The content issues are often magnified tenfold for that sector. And so, the lack of process can be really difficult, and workflow can align all those people and introduce that process. So not having one means that how can you possibly begin to map all of these people and these tasks into some kind of process and order that's needed. So I think a workflow really allows you to identify two key things. One is gaps and one is overlaps. So obviously if there's a gap in your workflow, something's not going to get done. If there's an overlap in your workflow, perhaps there's two people misunderstanding their role or their task or their responsibility, and you end up with duplication of content, which is a waste of effort on someone's part. So I think they're equally dangerous, I suppose, but a workflow will allow you to identify that. And I think a workflow is it's the stages the content goes through. It's a process, and then by itself, that's valuable, but really you can only leverage that for full efficiency if you've got the clear role. So I always think that workflow and clear roles and responsibilities, or the people, when they come together in a considered manner, that's when you can really start being efficient and start to sort of scale. In the same way, I think a style guide and content templates come together better.
Yeah, I think you said it there, and it seems so simple, right? Whenever you look at a workflow, you are finding gaps and overlaps. Who should be doing what? But in every content organization, I've found that there's either not personal agency, where you have agency and confidence that you are doing these things in a well-executed way, in an efficient way, or you don't have the, an understanding that you should raise your hand and say, I think this is a bottleneck, or a manager is looking for consistently looking for those gaps, finding them. I think if you, put a mirror in front of your team's, processes, and how frequently do every role on your team, how frequently do they raise their hand and call out a potential process issue? They don't all have to be validated. But it's so important here. And this is a Kanban board. And, if you missed the webinar we did with Andrea Fragrier on agile marketing, that's, again, you mentioned it early on. Do you have 15 content projects in process and you're not getting any of them over the finish line? I think that's so common. Like, we've got this spreadsheet, here's our content strategy, we've got 90 things we want to do. And how many did we publish? Oh, only 3 last week. It's such a common thing to have either too many cooks in the process, in the auditing process. Everyone on the team doesn't feel like, once they hand it off, they're done, they're moving on to the next thing. They don't really get, ownership of the process and the product. And then again, you're just having so many open projects and not finishing them really dovetails into, having that effective workflow. And I'd love for you to walk through, your ideal workflow states. This is something that, gives a general outline, but what are some things that you've done when establishing this to make sure that everybody has the ownership that you've mentioned?
Yeah, bro. Just quickly go back on the other point. Sorry, Jeff. Just want to add that it's not a blame game. So I think having accountability, it's not, so if John in legal is a bottleneck, then let's find out why. It's not just like, right, pack up your desk, John, it's time to go. It's like, I think it can be I think people perhaps might feel like they're going to be exposed, but again, it's meant to be a positive thing to kind of figure out, okay, we need to give John some help or whoever it might be. So yeah, it's not a blame game, but I think accountability is necessary for progress. And then coming back to this, so this workflow diagram is from one of our guides, I think. So it's one I'm familiar with, and it's based on a typical website redesign project. Now, arguably, there's not a typical anything in the world of content. And so, people who are with us today might be looking at this and thinking, well, there's half those stages I wouldn't do, or there's like half of my stages are missing. It's very, and that's kind of the point I was meant to mention earlier when I was talking about universities. Like, you might need several different workflows within one organization, depending on the project and the content and whatever it may be. So this workflow here, now I think in terms of what stages make an effective workflow, well, any stage that's needed. So, for me, I've been asked this in the past, there's no magic number or golden rule. It's not like you have to have 6 stages, anything less and you're missing, anything more and you're causing, unnecessary delays. You need the amount of stages that are right for whatever, again, the content, the project or the organization at hand. This typical workflow we actually share in our content strategy masterclass, and it's around a group task. So what we do, we ask, it's based on a 750 word web page. So no other content types, no assets, just 750 words on a very standard web page. So if you were trying to create that web page, we ask all the attendees to the masterclasses, how long would it take to get that content through each of these stages? And we've done dozens of these masterclasses with thousands of attendees over the last 4 years, and the average for a 750 word page comes out of 15 hours without fail. That average is, I think it was once 13 hours, but it's gone up to 15 hours. Now within that data set, some people mark down that they fly through this workflow for that page in a couple of hours, and others say, oh, it's going to take me 23 hours. So that's why we settle on the average, which is about 15 hours. And for me, that stat never fails to frighten me, because if that's the time and effort and resource and money and all that stuff needed to create one page, then scale that up to all your other web pages, all your other content types and formats, and it's just baffling. So it's frightening to think how much effort content takes, and it's often, I think, underestimated how much effort content takes. And that's why a workflow can help with that, because you can start to look at, right, these are the stages we've got, this is who's responsible, and it's not very scientific, but perhaps you can start to make educated guesses based on previous projects and experience as to, all right, how long will we need to take our content through each of these stages of our workflow? Okay, quite clearly we're going to need to bring in some freelance copywriters, or we're going to need to crew up for this project, or whatever those kind of insights and decisions may be, rather than just kind of see what happens. So I think, yeah, there is no magic number for the number of stages, but and looking at this diagram that we've got here, review and revise, that could be several feedback loops. That might be legal, then marketing, then brand and voice and tone. So it's not, even though it's visually it's linear, it's not necessarily a linear process in action when you're actually going through the workflow yourself.
Right, and you mentioned it before when you're talking about not the blame game. It's, you may have legal review, may have product validation required. You may have subject matter experts who should never be on the hook to write content, but you may need to interview them and document transcripts and things to validate that review process. So there's so many different possible parallel paths. But again, as we'll mention in the future, what this also can do is allow you to be more honest about your costs, be more honest about the roles and responsibilities, because those same people who were saying it's 15 hours to get a page through the pike may also say that their expenses are only maybe $100 for that page. Well, when you actually dive in and do that math, it starts to get upside down. But we'll get to that in a minute. I really wanted to kind of get your sense on the who's part of these teams and doing these work and what are doing this work processes and these stages, and where have you seen, you know, the overlaps that have hurt teams or the overlaps that help?
Yes, I think, again, every content team is different. One common thing I've experienced myself and seen through, you know, research with our customers and just being part of the content community is the multiple hat wearing people. And I think that's probably extending a bit now to being less of a swim lane mentality and structure to teams. I've visualized workflow in the past, and it's very much been this task that gets done by this person, then this task straight after, you know, and so you see the little colored bars going down, and it is like a swim lane. Everyone's in their lane doing their one thing, one after another. And I think it's starting to, you know, disciplines starting to cross over. I think more teams are becoming multidisciplinary, more people are becoming multidisciplinary in their individual roles. And I'm definitely seeing that in content in UX and content and design, you know, so content is UX, UX is content, and, you know, and it's like, it's not like, right, write the words and think about this and think about that. All these disciplines are merging, you know, into whatever, you know, we could get bogged down in semantics now, Jeff, with job titles, but, you know, whatever it's called, content, you know, if you're a content designer or a content strategist or a UX specialist, whatever it is, people are doing lots of things, you know. And again, this is where workflow is important. If you're managing all these different tasks, so, you know, I gather content, I write content, I edit content, I edit content from people on the gather content team, external writers, I'm working with designers, I'm talking at conferences, you know, there's all these different content types for different reasons that I'm involved in. So I'm defining workflows, I'm working to other people's workflows, you know, all these things, planning, scheduling, SEO, etc. But if I don't know, you know, where I am in a workflow, if I don't define a workflow for others, and even for myself, then it becomes very messy very quickly. You know, it's not like, you know, you're 6 months down the line, like, oh, it's again a bit confusing now. It's like immediately it's just like, oh, this is overwhelming, and I've just lost control of all this content and what's needed. And as somebody who works with other people, so people who, you know, write for gather content and so on, if I've not got a handle on that, then how can I expect anybody else to have a handle on that? And I think that's where, coming back to what you're saying about, you know, overlaps and gaps and what people are needed or etc., somebody definitely needs to take responsibility for the workflow. And by that, I mean defining the workflow. Now that's a collaborative effort in order for it to be effective. Bring people along for the journey, you know, and then they'll understand it better when they get back to their desk to do their task. But somebody who's going to take the mantle of, right, we're going to define this workflow, but then also disseminating that to anybody who's needed, communicating that, visualizing that, managing that, tracking the progress, reporting on the progress, like all these, you know, it's not just we've got a workflow, back we all go to our silos, you know, there needs to be an ongoing view of that and the impact that workflow is or isn't having, I think. So really thinking about the people involved. And it comes back to gaps and overlaps again, you know, right, why we, I don't know if I've got the stat here, but there was at gov.uk, there was one department and they had a 27-step approval process. Now, it didn't say if there were 27 approvers or whether that was, you know, perhaps 3 people, but immediately, and it's not for me to say that that wasn't effective for them, but it does, it's a bit of a red flag, I think, if there's like that many stages. So really thinking, who do we need involved? And they have to serve a purpose, otherwise they shouldn't be there, because it's just going to delay things and derail things. But again, it's not necessarily, you know, linear, you know, one person after another. It's very, it can be quite complex, the structure of a team.
Yeah, when you think about it that way, it still wows me that you can go through that long process. How can you afford to publish a piece of content that isn't successful? Right, in that kind of framework, you know, you almost have to think about it. You know, if you went through that whole process and then that item is consistently maybe not as good as one's competitors, or it wasn't effectively researched, or it isn't creating you know, recurring traffic, how can you possibly afford that if you've got all those steps and, you know, those checks and balances? People are really, you know, they're fooling themselves by misappropriating like the real costs of content. Because you have to manage that at that level. Everyone on the team should know the risks of publishing bad content, the risks of publishing content that isn't reviewed, or content that isn't governed, and be on the same page. Because you may find out, like you mentioned, do we really need all 27 of those review paths, or can we publish them, and be comfortable with that risk? The business needs to make that decision, and then associate the real costs of what you've done, and the costs that if you do all of that work and it doesn't have that success path that you want, gosh, that creates a real big bind for the team. When you're looking at content creation, time windows, scope windows, costs of the resources, what other aspects do you consider when calculating that, and when you're communicating with teams, how vital it is to get real on the overall costs of what you're doing?
Yeah, like I don't think that calculating the cost of content is an easy task, because I mean it depends how you approach it. I've seen some calculators which are just like, right, how long will it take to do this content, and then how many bits of content are there, and how much is the hourly rate of your writer. I think that's like that's better than nothing. It's like it gives you a sense, okay, I'm going to need more writers. But I think even if you ask me, like, Rob, okay, that last, I don't know, blog push you wrote, what was the cost of that? Well, I don't really work by an hourly rate, and so it's like, oh, okay, I don't know. And also, am I assessing that cost based on the ROI of that content? And it's like there's so many different areas. I think anything you can do to try and calculate it, with the kind of caveat that it may not go to an exact budget, or you may find out that partway through a project you need to kind of crew up or change things. Anything you can do, and this triangle I think is used for lots of things, including kind of project management. And say you can only have two of, I don't know, there's something, isn't there, where you can't have it all or something. If you want more, we want to increase the scope, we're also going to need more time, type thing. And there was a survey by Content Science Review, and the survey said that 54% of organizations don't know the annual budget for content. And it's just like, wow. So again, imagine spending lots of money on poor quality content, or imagine not even knowing what you're spending on poor quality content. And often I think a reaction is, well, let's just do more content. And Sarah Richards, who wrote Content Design, said, it's not more content, it's just like smarter content. And I think we just need smarter operations behind that content as well. And part of that is the cost of creating content. So it depends how a particular organization, or if you're an agency working with clients, it depends how you work and what your business model is. So agencies I've worked at in the past, there was an hourly rate for content creation. And it was always a little bit like plucking figures from thin air. It's like, okay, I know that you want me to write this amount of content, and I think it's going to take this amount of hours. Once we were committed, if it went beyond that, we either had to have a difficult conversation and ask the client for more money, or we had to spend more time unpaid creating that content. So it's not an easy thing, but these three factors here are good. What is the scope? What am I creating? How much time do I think it's going to take? And if we're thinking about writers with an hourly rate, for example, what does that equate to in terms of their time and therefore money? But it's not a straightforward. I don't think it's straightforward. And if anybody who's here today with us has got a straightforward way, please share. But even just acknowledging the fact that you want to be thinking about this is a good start. And I think the best thing is just, give it a go, try and calculate the cost of your next piece of content, and then keep doing it. You'll learn through doing. So if you're like, right, we over budgeted that, we under budgeted that. Why was that? Was it because it took twice as long? Was it because you needed to bring someone else in halfway through? Was it because the scope changed? Try and identify the reasons why you either got close to or strayed far from that budget, which will inform the next kind of exercise of costing it then as well.
Yeah, I think you got to cost out the life of the content too. So there's a cost of management, cost of governance. There's a cost of that, if you're auditing, if you are reviewing it prior to publish, it's all the humans that are touching it. We did some research and surveying and got really, really in detail. And that average per page, was over 1,500 if you look at hours. From some of the research that was done, and that's some stuff that I know we're looking to update in 2019. Now that we think that this is becoming a more mature market, but yes, if you're going to spend let's say N hours of people's times in-house, even if you're outsourcing to get some cost benefit, the overall cost per item is very high. Again, it creates this, it costs you a lot. It's costing your business a lot, really making deliberate decisions about what you're creating, what you're improving, what you're expanding. And then you've got to do everything you possibly can to make sure that it is high quality, comprehensive, and that it's going to be successful. Because if the cost of one item burning out, or you publishing those 10 items and they just didn't succeed, it's way bigger than just the invoice you received from your outsourced writer. And I think that's really a hurdle a lot of teams can't get over. I don't know, that was $100. That's how much we paid Jim for that. Not reality. It really burned up your business, and that's something that we see a lot. And this is a topic with repurposing and improvements that can get more for your money. How do you view? I know you repurpose well. I mean, you take subject matter expert materials, content upgrades, masterclass materials, and turn it into a lot. Is this a way for you to get more for the content investment? Do you see it that way?
Yes, definitely, provided that content has a purpose. So it's not just repurposing for the sake of it. It's
Right.
It's like, right, okay, I've got this webinar recording. I could pay to get it transcribed and turn that into a long form written piece of content for the blog. But why? So it's always asking that question, why? What's the purpose of the content? There's an analogy that we've used a lot of gather content. It's a bit cheesy, but we've used that gather content. It's like the turkey. So you have a turkey on Christmas Day and you slice it up. So the turkey is your main piece of content, and then you slice it up, and then it might go into a sandwich and into a curry, and the turkey gets used in lots of different ways. And that's what we can do with our content. We can repurpose it. So yes, with a webinar, we'll have a webinar recording in our resources. I might get one transcribed so it sits on the blog. With our books that you mentioned, it might be that within that there's a workshop run-through task or like a checklist. Right, we can pull that out into a separate asset. It's gated content. It's good for lead generation. So again, that's the business goal. But is this a topic that we know people, our audience, are searching for or need help with? So repurposing content is something we do a lot of at Gather Content, and it's being completely transparent. Part of it is that it's a quick win. I already know this topic resonates because we've had several hundred people sign up. So not everybody consumes content in the same way. Not everybody wants to watch a 1-hour webinar recorded. Not everybody wants to read a PDF or printed book. Everybody has their own way, and sometimes they have they want to consume content in different ways depending on if they're commuting or curled up at home or wherever that may be. So it's really it's coming back to that very traditional content strategy definition and thinking of the right content in the right place at the right time. And repurposing content does allow you to achieve that from an audience perspective, but it also does allow you to scale and make the most of existing content. So you're not starting from scratch every time. And I think that's really important. And for me, it does come back to this kind of the operational side of content or content operations. So by having things like a workflow in place, a content style guide, clearly defined roles, structured content templates, that's where you can really allow your systems and allow your operations to do the heavy lifting for you. So I don't want writers to be confused as to how they need to provide content to me. I want them just to be able to write. That's where their strength is. I don't want them to get bogged down in the formatting and all of that stuff that's important. But I want to put the things in place, like a workflow, like the right technology, like a style guide that's going to again make their lives easier. That will allow us to repurpose content, optimize content effectively and efficiently, and just scale the operations, scale the content. Again, quality content with a purpose, but scale the content and try and bring in some kind of repeatability. So not every project feels like started from scratch. Not every article, every piece of content feels like, here we go again. I want people to enjoy what they're doing with content. And I think, a workflow was one part of that, but absolutely repurposing that is a big part of what we do, definitely.
Yeah, I think that, it's such a signal that your team's overwhelmed, overworked, trudging along with inefficiencies if you don't have repurposing as part of your every as part of every month review, bi-weekly review. If you're not updating, expanding, linking, optimizing content tactically, and you don't even know where to start with either of these two things, it's such a sign that your team is just hanging on, getting what they're publishing out the door. This is really where tuning up the workflow can allow your more critical roles to think about. Like you mentioned, I love. I mean, what a great takeaway and win. It's before you repurpose, make sure the content actually has a purpose. Before you optimize, make sure you're doing it not just for the sake of updating, but also you want to make it more resonate with the audience that page is already attracting. And those two goals, in addition to the fact that these can be quick wins, that's worth the price of admission today. I think that's really brilliant. And something that everybody should really take stock and say, do we have an effective repurposing strategy? Are we optimizing content tactically and regularly? And if we're not, why? And I think a lot of the answers are going to be, we're just trying to hit our editorial calendar in the first place, But yeah, I thought that was really, really poignant. And as far as that stack, what's your dream stack internally, and how does that compare with what you're currently using, or what Gather Content offers today? And then if there's anything, what hasn't worked, kind of in your experience, or what do you see with clients that hasn't worked?
Yeah, so I don't know if I've got a dream stack, because there's so many tools. I'm always willing to try new stuff, and often it's the tools get chosen by other people within the business who are better placed to choose those tools. So often my stack is just my stack. So I'm happy to talk to what I do currently use. I mean, clearly, it would be silly if I didn't use Gather Content for content production, but I do use Gather Content. We all use it as much as we can. So, I create all the content for our weekly newsletter, blog articles, ebooks, wherever it might be, whatever content I'm creating. I know the sales team do their RFPs within there. Customer success use of a help documentation, etc. So Gather Content is clearly the staple part of our content stack, but also just other tools that we use. So for social media scheduling of content, we use Content Cal. I mean, there are loads of tools out there. We used to use Edgar, but that's what we're currently using. And we've recently moved over to HubSpot, actually, for workflows and automation, and nurturing. And we used to use Drip and Autopilot, but we settled on HubSpot because the integrations are more for what, I'm not going to say they're better, they're more for what we need as a business, because again, so much of this comes back to the ROI. So one thing I've been trying to do since I moved into this new role in February is scale our content production. So I know that masterclasses and webinars, they're good lead generators for the organization, but also I know that it's content that's well received and respected by our audience.
Right.
So it's like, right, that makes sense to scale that up. Now I'm in a fortunate position, and one that I think it's the opposite to many businesses, where I can get that content done quite quickly, either through myself or freelance writers, or just partnering with peers. Would you like to present a webinar for us? Yes. You did one for us, Jeff, just not so long ago on best practices for conducting a content audit. Fantastic. So that side of it, it takes time, and effort and work. But for me, that's always been the easier part of it. The hardest part for me has been if someone comes to me and says, what content is performing best for us? And this, going back to kind of how much does content cost, how much value can we put on content? And, that sometimes, it might have only taken me 2 hours to write that article, but nobody's looked at it. That could have taken me a day. And, it's organically brought in so much traffic that's led to gated assets, which led to leads, etc. So there's so many different areas to consider when looking at the ROI. But with HubSpot, we can start to see that I can now look at, I've got a dashboard and I can see this is how many net new leads you've got. This is the channels that have been performing well, and the formats and the topics, and that informs my other content decisions then around what topics are resonating. So yeah, HubSpot, gather content, Content Cal. Yes, we use Google Analytics, Slack, because we're a completely remote team. Yeah. So that's just from the communication side, not like the content production or management side. And we've recently moved from WordPress to Webflow for our marketing site and blog CMSs as well.
Nice. And that one challenge of trying to identify that return on investment, make sure that you're being efficient, understanding that return on investment. I mean, that's what we focus on every day too. And I know that we've had those conversations. It's really where am I getting my best bang for my buck? For every hour applied. Is this something I just had to do for the business for one reason or another, or am I tactically making the right decisions about what I'm producing and making sure that I'm becoming more efficient over time? I mean, if you really critically look at everything you built so far this year or last year, and being able to slice and dice it page over page, topic over topic, type over type, that's really the one of the key values that we have chatted about with MarketMuse, and then being able to operationalize it with gather content. It's a huge win. I did have a question before we get into how to evolve over time, and I know we've talked about this a lot. I had a question that came in on GoToMeeting, and it was, when we're thinking about measuring, like you just mentioned, and learning in that workflow, if you're in a spot where you're producing an overwhelming amount of content, what are the ways you could streamline content performance evaluation and insights delivery to your team, so that what does that internal reporting look like that is actually going to get into the hands of people that are making the decisions? How have you seen workflows at that measure and learn phase get optimized?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, until recently, we didn't really have the data we needed to gather content to report on things. And even now, I think we're not necessarily data-led, we're data-informed. So, a very basic example is one webinar might get 500 registrants and one might get 300, but those 300 might be more engaged or might lead to more conversions. So, that number in isolation doesn't necessarily bring that many insights, I think. So the way that we're reporting at the moment, I mean, because we use gather content for our workflow, I can see, we can set due dates, so I can see how the content's progressing in like a timeline in terms of that. But the report that I'm using is just from HubSpot. I'm not really reporting around the workflow as such. I'm reporting on, again, the channels and the content and the performance of the content. So yeah, I'm not really reporting on the workflow, unless I've misunderstood the question there.
No, Jeff. It's a great thing. The question really is to say, what are the ways, if we're creating a lot of content, and frankly, it illustrates that, and same as in my shoes as well. There's many ways that our content strategy team could be critically thinking about our workflows, and for our clients, we do this constantly. And like you said, you use your own software as well, and you have to, just realizing that you're not, nobody's perfect. And if you're generating, let's say, hundreds of thousands of content items, how do you take performance information and integrate it into the cycle? And what we've seen work very well, whether you're using MarketMuse in tandem with your CMS, like a HubSpot or OpenText or WordPress, whatever the case may be, is really to say, what are the ways that we were most effective and efficient with our workflow? It's understanding your costs. It's saying, wow, whenever we publish content that's in this format on this topic, approaching, that was a quick wins, like you mentioned. These are great. Here's the ones that didn't work. Let's analyze why. I think that streamlining the process in that stage is about taking it outside of your team, really digging in, and then reporting those findings and next steps for tweaking the workflow. And I love this example. So we say, we know that when we do this, this is going to have, immediate benefit. This is how Rob should be using his time. I mean, I think that there's a lot of ways to optimize that. I like to take it out of the normal workflow to really do a deep dive, regular site-wide or network-wide, if you're a bunch of publishers, regular auditing, regular inventorying, but also targeted content auditing. I'm going to look at all my pages about buyer personas, and I want to learn something from that so that I can communicate with that team. I hope that answers the audience question. I think is defining your regular content auditing inventory. It's defining your targeted auditing. It's maybe audit the things that cost a lot, maybe audit the things that had the highest efficiency rates more regularly or costed a lot, or use more expensive people. I think that you can find a great cadence of like targeted projects to weave in to your large scale projects. So hopefully that was a good response to that question. And if not, please shoot us a note, shoot Rob and me a note. We'll elaborate. I got another great question from the audience on this topic too. You kind of mentioned it, Rob, for when you're doing a master class, when you're doing a book, when you're doing a blog, it's a different process. Do you have a different process and a different workflow for those different types of projects?
Yeah, it depends who's involved really. Often it's just me. So I'm like, well, I'll just get this done where I can get it done. But yeah, so what I'm trying to do, I'm trying to almost systematize the operations behind it. So it's just, I found I was having, regardless of what the content format or type was, I was having lots of, I was going into my inbox and trying to find information I sent to somebody else who'd done a webinar and copying and pasting that. I was just like, I hadn't systematized how I was informing people who were helping create the content, what they needed and why and when and so on. So I've just, I've now got writing for gather content guidelines. I've got guidelines around if you're going to be a webinar presenter, what we need, and for a landing page. And it's just so I can fire that off. They've got what they need. I don't have to think about it. So I'm trying to systematize in that way. I would say yes. Depend on who's involved. Most of the time, I have a different workflow for different content types or different formats. So for the weekly newsletter, me and one other person involved, and they're really just there to kind of sense check it and proof it. So it's a very standard draft, edit, refine if needed, approve, publish. With I don't know, if we stick with the masterclass example, there are different components to that. So there's the the topic, so there's kind of all the discussions there. But when we've got the date and the topic agreed, the next step for me is getting that landing page done. So there's a workflow for that landing page. Then there's a separate workflow really for kind of the slide deck and the process for the day. Same with the books. There's a different workflow there because we're bringing in designers and printers if they're going to be physical copies. So yes, there are different workflows for the different content formats. And I think another example outside the gather content where I see this quite common, going back to higher ed, is for a course book, or we call them a prospectus in the UK. I think they're view books in the US. So basically just a book about the university, why you should come here, and these are our courses. And lots of universities have print versions and digital versions. And we're seeing an increase now where they're trying to streamline those workflows. So some are using gather content to try and do that. But outside of that, they're just trying to think, right, they just reviewed the workflows and like, okay, the end result is different in the sense of this is printed and this is digital. But actually, 90% of the content within those formats is the same. And most of the people involved and the stages involved are the same. So they're just trying to kind of stream that and think, right, how can we, and Jeff, this comes back to like repurposing content. How can we create content once and then publish everywhere, whether that's print and digital? So there are ways, I think, to achieve individual content types and formats through one workflow. But it depends on what the content is, and is the content going to be the same across those formats? So for me, if I'm pulling a checklist out of a book, then I'm not going to need a separate workflow for that. It's already sort of done. But often, if we're talking, e-newsletter, webinar, book, article, most of the time it's a separate workflow because there are just different stages. There are different requirements, different people involved, and just different stages.
Yeah, I think that you said it in, summarizing format or type, the team, with the roles and responsibilities, and the frankly, the entire marketing team or whomever their investment, I think, dictates kind of what process. Maybe you have something that's a quick process or speed desk. In news, obviously, you're always going to have kind of a speed desk. One of the news teams that we work with, large publishers. You're also looking at who's involved in the editing and the review. If you're in a regulated market, if you're in pharma, life sciences, which is one of our main areas as well, you'll see, that there's different workflows for that. If there's legal review, et cetera. So I think that there's two or three ways that you define the parameters and have, where depending on the team, depending on your how much investment you can make, and depending on that review process, that you're going to need multiple workflows for different types of projects.
I also think that bringing this back to the workflow, and I think like multi-source is an issue as well.
Yeah.
So there are lots of people creating content, so workflow can connect those sources, connect those silos. And the multi-channel, one workflow or many to deliver to different channels will depend. And I think there's often a need to sort of speed of delivery, create content more quickly, and a workflow can facilitate that without sort of panic. And then I guess with the governance that you kind of mentioned as well, just sort of, I think having a workflow can stop the review and approval loops taking too long. And again, depend on the format and the type. It may be that marketing, legal, and finance are necessary, whereas in another piece of content, it's only marketing. So by definition, it should take less time because there's less stages in the workflow. So but a workflow can help to. I think a workflow raises all of these questions: who's producing it, for what channel, for what audience, for what formats, and so it can only be a good thing that a workflow is kind of the catalyst for these discussions, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's right. And there was another audience question that dovetails well with it's kind of the question is, how do you ensure that people are following these steps properly and up to the levels? I think obviously sharing that information early on, making sure they really understand it. How do you introduce it and influence adoption? One thing I did want to mention was when you say govern content, it's not necessarily the same as governing the process. How do you, how do you make sure that your teams are ramping quickly and they're avoiding any kind of getting off the process?
Yeah, anything where people involved is difficult. I gave a webinar last week about content style guides, and a big section of that was how do you disseminate it to make sure they're using the style guide. So it's the same thing applies. Like having a workflow is just half the battle. Getting people to kind of understand it and follow it and be involved in it is the other half. And I think having an owner for that workflow, for that process, is the first step. Again, it comes back to, I think it's just about managing expectations, and it's communication. Again, it's making people understand it's not a blame game. It's about productive accountability, positive accountability. And I do think if you can involve them in defining the workflow, then that they understand it. They've been involved from the beginning or familiar, rather than just going, this is the way we're doing it, and this is what you need to do when. That might work, but nobody likes to be dictated to in that sense. So I think bringing people along for the journey can definitely help with that. So whether that's in a workshop setting, let's literally map. People have post-its, don't they, and dots and stickies. Let's map the workflow. Let's map the stages and discuss that as a group. And then I think, I mentioned this earlier, but people consume information better in different ways. So you might use a tool like Gather Content that's the best kind of way to represent that workflow. It might be that you create one of those diagrams, that one we saw earlier, like the swim lane one. So visualizing the workflow can sometimes help, rather than just being like, this stage, this stage, this stage. Could be it's in a spreadsheet, whatever those methods are, to try and communicate to people in a way that makes sense to them. I mean, none of these things are going to be perfect solutions. There's always going to be somebody who, diverts or resists or challenges. But I think as long as your workflow is being informed and has a purpose behind it, and there's a reason why these stages are there and these people are needed at those stages. In the same way, data can support so many awkward conversations about, why am I writing like this? Because our style guide says, and it's not, an editor just being egotistical. It's because that's the language our users use. So for example, just having that kind of rationale behind things to refer back to. So documenting the workflow is probably valuable in that sense as well, just to kind of take it back to like, this is why we got the workflow.
Yeah, just some quick whys of why do we do it this way is often important. And I know in the content delivery book that I held up earlier that you published, there's a section about doing workshops consistently internally. We do hackathons in-house where like we put multiple teams in the rooms and say, go knock out a content strategy using these technology, including MarketMuse Suite, and just please follow our workflow. And just to make sure that everybody is kind of encouraged to get on the bus and to see how great things can be when you do follow those processes and you do get those repetitions because you're going to have people at all skill sets and having that have ramped at different levels. Put them into rooms, making sure they're part of the process. Absolutely, accountability in a positive direction. We all are all trying to raise the boats for us and our clients every day. And I think that's a really great way to end a discussion about workflows. It's making sure that the teams are as aligned as you can. Handling anyone that's dissenting in a really positive way has a huge impact, and introducing it to new employees, build that onboarding process, and maybe try to make that a little bit of a fun thing, like a workshop, like a hackathon, so that they don't feel overwhelmed. Last mention, Gather Content offering a 30-day free trial to viewers of this live webinar and the recording, which also make sure to look for. Go to blog.gathercontent.com or shoot Robert a note. Here's his Twitter and his LinkedIn. We, as always, for anyone connected to our webinars, have a free topic report available to anyone, and that we'll walk through it in detail in a strategy session. I also earlier in the webinar, if you were listening, gave you another way of getting connected for a more in-depth content strategy session. Again, Rob, thank you so much for joining us today. I think this is really powerful. I think that there's 5 or 6 takeaways from this discussion that are quick wins, going to really level up teams, try to make you more self-aware about the things that can influence ROI and sales, ROI and progress your efficiencies. I'll give you the last word.
Yeah, I mean, my last word on workflows is that they should be there to help people and be a positive thing, I think. So, and not be, something that's daunting or frightening. And aside from that, just, thank you for inviting me to the chat today. And definitely, if anybody's got any questions about workflow or Gather Content or content operations in general, and my other favorite topic, style guides, then tweet me, email me, LinkedIn me, all those different methods. I'm always happy to answer questions and share resources and try and help out. So thank you for everybody who did join us and ask questions today. Really appreciate it. Thank you to everyone at MarketMuse for bringing me along for the chat as well.
All right, thanks again, and thanks everybody for joining us, whether you're live or on the recording. All right, have a good one. See you.